Good evening, students. This is Mr. Kistler. I'm sorry that the video didn't come out yesterday. A few things I just wanted to explain to you from Thursday's lesson, excuse me. So first of all, we talked about the key features of the constitutional system, and we had the three branches, the separation of powers, and the different ways that there was election or selection of the officers of those different branches. Now, as far as the checks and balances goes, this would be between the three branches. There are different ways that they check and balance each other so that none of them gets too much power. The first clear one would be the power of the veto, where the president can veto legislation from Congress, even if it passes both houses. And so the president has to sign it in order to make it law. But the president can veto those laws if he so chooses. Now, Congress can have a further check by overriding the veto, and that takes 2/3 of each house, which is very difficult to have 2/3 of senators and representatives agree on the same thing, especially probably today in the age of a pretty sharp partisan divide. Other ways in which we see checks and balances: the president chooses the Supreme Court justices, and the Senate must confirm those choices by a majority vote. Impeachment process can be undertaken by the House. Then that trial takes place in the Senate. The president is impeached by the House. The House then prosecutes the president in the court of the Senate. So that's another way in which the legislature has a check on the presidency. So that's the basic idea of checks and balances. Federalism, here we have an important concept here of dual sovereignty that you can see on your outline. Dual sovereignty means that, in a weird way that was strange for both the for many of the political thinkers of the day, both the federal government and the state governments were sovereign. Now, how can that be? Was one of the questions, right? How can both be sovereign? The buck has to stop only one place. But if they have different spheres in which, then there can be dual sovereignty. And so the federal government is supreme in areas of, say, national defense, tariffs, and things like that. The states are supreme in their own spheres, especially relating to the governing of their own populations, things like health and education and welfare. But the key, though, another key part of this is the supremacy of the federal government. The federal government does have the right to set standards. And then over all that is the Constitution. The Constitution is said to be the supreme law of the land. And that's, of course, important too. So federalism is a two-level system of sovereignty. The states really exist, and the federal government really exists. And that balance over time has changed. It's kind of gone different ways, and it's often debated. But there are states are recognized, in the Constitution. The last thing here is that the Constitution can be amended. And there's a way in which the Constitution amendments can be proposed, and that's either by 2/3 of each House of Congress proposing an amendment, or 2/3 of the states calling for a convention. You may have heard that there's an effort underway to have just such a convention. I think it tends to be favored more on the conservative side of things. But they're trying to get 2/3 of the states to have a convention. Getting kind of close, according to someone who just told me the other day. So that's the way to propose an amendment. But to actually pass the amendments, you have to have 3/4 of the states agree on them. And so either the state legislatures or ratifying conventions in the states have to agree to ratify those amendments. And so that's important. Again, one of the ways in which you see the preservation of the states in the Constitution is that it's not a certain percentage of the population that has to do it, but a certain percentage of the states. Okay. So those are the key features of the constitutional system, rounded out from what we talked about last time. I also want to say something about the Bill of Rights, because the Constitution was drafted without a Bill of Rights. And that caused some concerns among those who liked the idea of the Constitution, but were not comfortable giving the federal government too much power, and were concerned that without a Bill of Rights, as many states had, that the federal government could become tyrannical. And therefore, there were some states that when they ratified the Constitution in their conventions, they said, we are rescinding our ratification if we do not get a Bill of Rights. Now, this was more controversial than you might think, because the people who drafted the Constitution didn't necessarily think they needed a Bill of Rights. And that's because the Constitution gives the federal government specific powers. In Article 1, Section 8, there's I think 17 enumerated powers, and then there's of Congress, and then there's the Elastic Clause, which we can look at next time. And then it has some powers for the judiciary and the executive, but it never gives the government the power to regulate speech or regulate the press or set up a national religion or quarter soldiers in homes. There's no power to do that granted in the Constitution. So the skeptics of the Bill of Rights said, we don't need to put that in there because there's no power to do the things you're worried about. And there's also an interesting point too, that they argued, well, if we list what the rights are in the Bill of Rights that the government can't violate, then the government will just do everything that's not on the list and will actually lose liberties. Okay. But the concerns were great enough that a more powerful federal government would violate people's rights, that the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were added and ratified in 1791. Okay. And so that illustrates a couple of things. One, again, the Constitution can be amended. That's part of its framework. And so the 27 amendments to the Constitution are not some weird thing that just appeared out of nowhere, but there's a process to amend the Constitution right in it. Second thing is the Bill of Rights has become very important. And early on, it only restricted the federal government. That's what it was applied to. It did not apply to the states. And the Supreme Court ruled that in the 1800s. So citizens got their rights from the states, and your primary citizenship was really with your state. And that will change as we go on here with the Civil War and aftermath. And so the Bill of Rights apply to the states today, but they did not originally. And they do that because of the 14th Amendment. And there's a little bit of a complicated story with all that. But the 14th Amendment is what incorporated those to the states. So that, I hope, gives you some explanation of the Bill of Rights and the key features of the system, and helps you for the quiz on Monday. So Brenda, would you like to say hi? Okay.